to meet on the unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples. Just a few housekeeping manners before we start. Washrooms are out, just out at the side of the door here to your right. I hope you all got a name tag when you came in. If not, there's still a moment. There are refreshments at the back table there, so please help yourself. There is a notice on the door in the back that we're not allowed to go out to the playground. So please don't. I don't know what will happen, an alarm or something. There's also a petition circulating to get Canada out of NATO. So if you would like to sign that, that's making its way through the room. Okay, I will turn the microphone over to Prakan, who will introduce it.
So my name is Furkan Galen, and I'm the chapter coordinator for the Metro Vancouver chapter of World Beyond War. This is a new chapter. We're literally just starting up, and today we have there's two events that happen today. One in Surrey, and this is the second one. And these are our first events of this chapter. So we're hoping to build this chapter, strengthen it with more people getting involved in it and becoming actively part of the coordinating committee so that we can move forward on different campaigns, like divestment campaigns or shutting down NATO bases campaigns, etc. There's a bunch of different campaigns that we can work on. As you were coming in, you probably signed the Declaration for Peace. If you haven't, please remember to do that. And then there's a little page there that also mentions a little bit of extra instructions for that. It will just tell us who wants to become part of the organizing committee for this chapter, which would mean you get involved in setting up these type of events and actively organizing them or organizing the different campaigns that we have. So to do that, you just put an O next to your name on the Declaration for Peace. And if you don't have that much time at the moment, maybe you can work on a subcommittee, for example. We're going to have different subcommittees focused on the different campaigns, like divestment or the other ones I mentioned. Then you can put an S next to your name. And that will tell us what level of involvement you want. Or you can talk to any of us and let us know as well. So one of the things that when I discuss with people what World Beyond War is about, of abolishing warfare, the very institution of warfare, the initial sort of reaction I typically get is, this can't happen, this is impossible, an impossible dream, it's human nature to fight. These are some of the responses I get. You know, people have always fought, they'll continue to fight. So normally, you know, one of the things I guide people to is the myths of war, which are documented. The World Beyond War website documents all these different myths and breaks them apart and shows how they're actually not true. And David is going to highlight some of those myths and show that they're not true. The other thing that I normally hear back is this is such a difficult task. How do we do it in this modern era? How do we get enough people mobilized to make this change? So there's some research that you might be familiar with, which indicates that if you get 3.5% of a population actively demonstrating or supporting a particular cause, they've always succeeded when they hit that threshold. If it's less than that threshold, well, you might succeed, you might not. But it seems to be, if you hit that threshold of 3.5% out there demanding something, it happens. Again, that looks like a huge number, but I did a little bit of research and looked at how many ridings are there in Canada. There's 338 ridings. And if you look at the average number of voters per riding, that number is about 75,000. So if you take 3.5% of that 75,000, it comes to about 2,600 people per riding. So when you look at it that way, it actually looks like it's an achievable target where we can target in each riding to get 2,600 people actively demanding that we get out of war, we get out of the institution of war and shut it down and stop this nonsense of attacking country after country, as happens on this planet at the moment. So we're going to have David Swanson coming up, and he's going to give a talk for about 30 minutes. After that, we'll have questions and answers. If you have questions, just raise your hand. And Lynn, where's Lynn in the back there? She will make a list of the people who want to ask questions, and we'll go in that order, and I'll bring the mic around. The second way to ask questions is you can write it out and give it to one of the volunteers, and we'll get that question asked from David. I'm going to introduce David. So David is an author, activist, journalist, and radio host. He is executive director of World Beyond War and campaign coordinator for rootsaction.org. Swanson's books include War is a Lie and When the World Outlawed War, as well as Curing Exceptionalism, War is Never Just, and War No More, A Case for Abolition. He's co-author of A Global Security System, An Alternative to War. He blogs at davidswanson.org and War is a Crime. He talks Talk Nation Radio, and he is a 2015, 16, 17, 18, and 19 Nobel Peace Prize nominee. Swanson was awarded the 2018 Peace Prize by the U.S. Peace Memorial Foundation. David holds a master's degree in philosophy from the University of Virginia and has lived for a long time and worked in Charlottesville, Virginia. So he's been a very busy person. So please welcome David Swanson.
Thank you, FurCan. Thank you all for being here. Thank you to FurCan for organizing this event and the great event that we just had in Surrey the past few hours. This is a terrific group for a first meeting of anything. I expect you will have some great successes before you get to 3.5% of the local population. For any of you who were in Surrey this afternoon, I apologize if I say anything I already said there. And for any of you who were not, I apologize if I think I've already said something or I forget what country I'm in. Just remind me. I typically do not leave my house, and if I do, it's not beyond walking distance. And I had 2 events in Seattle yesterday and 2 here today and another one in Seattle tomorrow. So just let me know if I say something 3 times. I did go have lunch by that Peace Arch and thought it was so wonderful for there to be a monument to peace. They are vastly outnumbered by the monuments to war, but it would be nice if those 2 peace-loving countries were peaceful toward the rest of the world, not just each other. As I remarked in Surrey, I'm fond of the late Robin Williams' characterization of Canada as a nice apartment over a meth lab, and I think that it could stay a nice apartment. There is no need for it to be doing odd jobs for the drug dealers downstairs. There's absolutely no reason for it, and for Canada to say no, as Ronald and Nancy Reagan used to say, just say no. If Canada would say no to participating in U.S. militarism, it would be a there are activist groups, peace activist groups here and everywhere doing good work. Often There are groups focused on particular wars, particular nations, Israeli wars, this kind of weapon, that kind of weapon. I think we all have to support all of those efforts and join them together. And join them together as well as activism against the whole institution of war. That means moving beyond better wars and humanitarian wars and good wars to no acceptance of war whatsoever. I don't know if Furkan mentioned, but we are starting to plan activities in Ottawa next spring when there's a big weapons show there to prevent it, shut it down, counter it with a peace show and other creative activities. So please be in touch with Furkan and with us at World Beyond War about bringing lots of people to Ottawa in the spring. When we started World Beyond War, it was with two ideas. One was to be global, to have an organization that matched the weapons dealers and the war profiteers and the organizations like NATO, and be global and be in every country and develop leaders and board members from all over the world. And with your help, we're making great progress at that. And the second part was to oppose war entirely, to make a case against war. Raise your hand if you can name the weapon that kills the most people.
5G.
Okay, anybody else?
Atomic bomb. And
These are all good answers, and when you ask a trick question, you're going to get a variety of good answers. We're going to have an endless question and answer session shortly. Yes, and people who heard me speak 3 hours ago know the answer that I want to give. Which, yes, you could argue that it's guns, and if nukes are used, it will be nukes. But it's the pocketbook, it's the wallet. The money that is spent preparing for wars and engaging in wars kills vastly more people than any of the wars. You could take less than 3% of just the US military budget and end starvation on Earth. You could take a little over, maybe less now than 1% of just the US military budget and end the lack of clean drinking water across the globe. You can take a small fraction of military spending and end various diseases, various health crises. You could invest in a Green New Deal of environmental sustainability beyond the wildest dreams of environmental groups for a little fraction of what's spent killing and traumatizing and injuring masses of people, creating refugee crises, endangering your own country, not protecting it, stripping your rights, degrading your culture, promoting bigotry and hatred and racism, militarizing the police, and impoverishing your economy, no matter how many people falsely claim that militarism is a jobs program. And so it's beginning to talk about the entire institution in these terms that allows for bigger coalitions, because environmental groups that haven't been banned from addressing militarism can recognize it as one of the chief causes of environmental destruction and climate collapse and join forces with anti-war activism. Groups that oppose racism or that favor money for schools. And by the way, free college has no bigger opponent in the United States than the military, because there would be no U.S. military if the U.S. had free college. Groups that oppose poverty, that seek rights for immigrants, that seek to maintain civil liberties while we have our freedoms stripped away in the name of freedom with every war. This is the sort of coalition we need to create that sees the overlap among the issues and works together to end racism and militarism and extreme materialism and environmental destruction. So World Beyond War is working primarily in 3 areas. There are all kinds of other campaigns, but we've decided to focus for the main on 3 areas, and one is divestment. We're getting cities like my city in Virginia and universities and investment funds and individuals to take their money out of weapons dealing. This is something that's educational, that stigmatizes what's been normalized, that has a financial impact, and lets people have a victory relatively easily compared to, shutting down the entire military. The second area is around bases. Around the world, we're working with groups that are actively engaged in trying to resist the construction of and shut down existing U.S. and NATO military bases, and around the world, domestic military bases of the countries that people are in. There are all kinds of ways, from the environmental destruction and the crime and the noise and so forth, to go after these bases. And the third area that we're really working on is education, more than activism, and that's events like these, online courses, books and videos, and working with schools and classrooms to educate people about war and about the possibility and desirability and necessity of ending all war, not just some wars. Let me ask what I asked at the last event, and that is, if you had to choose between saying war is never ever justifiable or sometimes some wars can be justified, raise your hand if you think that sometimes some wars can be justified. 2 hands. Raise your hand if
War on
you...
what? Like war on the vaccines, for example, that kind of war?
I'm using the war in perhaps a horribly limited sense to mean mass organized killing. So do you think that sometimes programs of mass organized killing can be justified? There were 2 brave hands for that. Do you believe that war can never ever be justified? Raise your hand if you believe that. Okay, so the important, obvious conclusion is that you guys are much smarter than people in Surrey. Because in Surrey, a lot of hands, I think at least half the hands went up for sometimes some wars are justified, and by the end of the event, most of those people were willing to raise their hand and say they've moved in the direction of believing no wars are ever justified. And the way that you move people in that direction, not that you can always persuade everyone, with a lot of people, if you sit down with them for a few hours and talk about it and address their particular line of thinking, you can. Is to talk about the reasons that people think wars can be justified and the reasons why wars and the whole institution of war need to be ended. And there's this idea that war is somehow like the weather, that it's just around and it always has been and always will be. And so we should stop deluding ourselves and fantasizing about a utopia and come to grips with the reality that you can't get rid of wars and try to limit them, make them better wars, but deal with the hard work that somebody has to do, right? And this is a very, very strange argument. When you look at, I mean, first of all, if something had always been around and everybody had always engaged in it, That wouldn't mean everybody couldn't stop. It's absolutely ridiculous. Most good changes have been ceasing to do something that had always been done. But if you look at the history of this species, since it became distinctly this species, for 90% of it, there was nothing remotely resembling anything you would call war. If you look at the last split second of human existence, war today doesn't remotely resemble what it was a couple of centuries ago. And if you look at societies, even the ones that have militaries and engage in war making, which is not all of them, but it's some of them, and the ones that engage in the most war making, like the place where I live, the vast majority of people never have anything to do with war directly themselves at all. They avoid it. And that tiny sliver of the population that takes part in war in some way, the vast majority of them suffer horribly. You have significantly increased suicides, significantly increased moral guilt and post-traumatic stress disorder, significantly increased chance, although it's still very low, of becoming a mass shooter in a shopping mall. And so to take something that most people avoid and seem to do just fine avoiding, right? There's no doctor out there, diagnosing, suffering from, war deprivation disorder, right? Nobody suffers a need for war. And then the people who do engage in war suffer dramatically from it, the vast majority of them. To call that somehow human nature is just patent nonsense, right? I mean, when you have nations that spend $0 on war, have no militaries, and then you have the United States at the other extreme that spends about as much as the rest of the world combined, most of which is its close allies and collaborators, there's not a single nation, there's not a single other nation that isn't closer to that zero than it is to the U.S. level of spending. The U.S. level of spending is a freakish thing that nobody else is remotely close to. And so for people in the U.S. to say to me, well, it's human nature, I get to say to them, well, what are the other 96% of humans? Are they Martians? Why does what 4% of humanity does get to be proclaimed human nature? Well, it's nonsense. It's not, human nature is not something you find in a laboratory. It's not something you can define with a concrete definition. It's just an excuse. It's just an excuse term. And so then you do have, the idea that well, sometimes war is necessary. It's defensive. Your country has been attacked. Your country must fight back, and your country must be prepared to fight back, and so you have to have wars and militarism. Well, you don't. And one reason you don't is that studies have well established over the past century or more that the strongest, most likely to succeed tools to resist occupation and tyranny are nonviolent ones, that they work better than violence. And as you move the world toward nonviolence and the rule of law, you reduce the chances of being attacked, but you also reduce the need to think in terms of militarism as defensiveness. If you want to go make that argument in countries that the United States and its allies are bombing, go do that. But to make that argument for US and Canadian military spending, who is it that's about to attack and occupy the United States and Canada? It doesn't exist. And so you distort the word defensive to mean, well, we're going to go defend those guys halfway around the globe, whether they like it or not. you have it, so every war is presented as this crisis of urgent necessity, principally because if they take too long starting the war, peace may break out. You got to start the war before the inspectors can say definitively that there are no weapons, because once they say that, it'll be harder to start the war. Every war is started with this faked urgency. At the same time, in most countries, they've started arguing that these wars are beneficial, right? So they're absolutely required. We're only doing it as a so-called last resort, which is, nonsense itself. There's no such thing as a last resort. You don't run out of ideas and efforts. You just stop trying them. But it's a last resort, but it's also beneficial. It's humanitarian. It's philanthropic. It's for the good of the people we're bombing. And of course, there's not a single humanitarian war that's actually benefited humanity. There's just this idea of it dangled out in front of us for the next war. And when, as 3 hours ago in Surrey, somebody tries to make that case, it's almost always on behalf of an imagined war that didn't happen, that they wish should have happened. And almost always that's Rwanda, right? It's not an actual war that actually happened. Because when you actually kill large numbers of people and traumatize children and create refugee crises and destroy societies and the natural environment and create disease epidemics and so forth, people don't appreciate it. You can say it's for human rights. We're dropping bombs on your houses for your rights, but it leaves out that big right not to have bombs dropped on your houses. So we try to address some of these myths, and there are endless myths and there are specific myths. In the United States, we have a whole endless saga of myth that goes by the name World War II, and I think will undoubtedly, there's never been an event where we didn't end up talking very much about that, so I'm sure we will. But we also have to start getting people to think in terms of war as an institution. Because if you could, I looked through just war theory, all the criteria you would need according to various academics dating back to when Christianity became an imperial religion, and a lot of the criteria are strictly impossible. Some of them are just not measurable at all, and others are amoral. They don't have anything to do with morality. But if you could fantasize a war in the future that met all the criteria of just war theory and that they were somehow justified as going to do more good than harm, it would also have to justify all the past decades of spending trillions and trillions of dollars in hopes that that good war would arrive someday. Because if you're going to take money away from food and medicine and a sustainable environment and all the human and environmental goods year after year after year, and invest it in a criminal enterprise that endangers you, generating hostility and enemies and strips you of your rights, in the hopes that one day there will be a war that meets all the criteria of being a good war. Well, it has to be an impossibly good war because it has to outweigh all that damage of all those years, and has to outweigh the significant risk that keeping the institution of war around is going to create a nuclear apocalypse. The doomsday clock the scientists set is closer to midnight than as close as it's ever been, and we have a significant risk of our luck running out. We have hundreds of incidents on record of intentional and accidental near nuclear apocalypses. We have dozens of nuclear bombs at the bottom of the ocean. We have one in a field in North Carolina. This kind of luck is the most phenomenal good luck I have ever heard of, and it will not last. And as the United States and its allies do everything they can to get Iran to get a nuclear weapon, and Donald Trump is passing nuclear technology to Saudi Arabia for the profits of his buddies, and nukes are proliferating, and there's a heroic effort by most countries in the world to ban nukes that we all need to support. At the same time, the lesson is being taught that if you have nukes like North Korea, you will not be bombed, and if you don't, look out, here we come. Unless we start scaling back the war thinking and the war institutions and replace a war economy and a war society with a peaceful one, we risk nuclear apocalypse, as we risk climate apocalypse, to which militarism is such a big contributor. So the case that we make for ending all war on the World Beyond War website and elsewhere looks at these myths and then looks at the reasons for ending the institution of war, which include its immorality, its endangerment, counterproductiveness in terms of protection, its environmental destruction, its erosion of civil liberties, its impoverishment of societies. It's not a jobs creator, it's not an economic benefit, and wouldn't it be sociopathic to support it, as many U.S. Congress members do on those grounds? Yes, we're bombing your countries, but it's a jobs program. That would be sick even if it were true, but it's factually false as well. And it's such a big contributor to xenophobia and Islamophobia and racism and bigotry. So the case can be made that we have to start engaging in peace movement activities that talk about themselves as steps toward abolition. That we don't just talk about opposing this war because it's the wrong kind of war, or Congress didn't authorize it and then it would be a good war, or we need the troops to be prepared for a better war. We don't want to waste our good troops on the wrong war. We don't want to spend money on the weapons that don't even work because of waste and corruption. We want to invest in the good weapons that kill the most efficiently. No, we have to instead start talking about scaling back an enterprise that is indefensible. And it sounds like a more radical case to say let's end all war and all preparations for war, rather than just let's end that one little bad war. But it actually makes sense and is built on facts. And if you're going to tell somebody, we have to end this war but be prepared for lots of other wars, that can confuse people, in fact. And it's sometimes difficult to make the argument for why, if militarism is defensive and necessary, this particular bit of it is wrong. If it's good to kill large numbers of people, why can't you torture a few of them? It's better than killing them. Why not? Well, you can't answer that kind of question unless you're against killing large numbers of people, which we need to be. There are things we're against. We don't talk about humanitarian rape. We don't talk about philanthropic child abuse. There are things that cannot be reformed, that cannot be done properly. And we need to put war in that list and treat it accordingly. Thank you. I'd be happy to take any questions, and I think Furkan has organized a list of them or something.
Okay, that was...
Yeah.
Okay, so if you have questions, just raise your hand and Lynn will keep track of the order, and I'll come around with the mic. And the other way to ask questions is you can write something down.
Thank you. And my first question, I won't count it in my goal, but is that one of your platforms is education. And I'm thinking that a function of that could be where you take the points of education which counter elements of the Pentagon's Department of Psychological Warfare, which is misinformation. So when they give out a news report or something and we know it's blatantly disinformation, an educational point could counter that, and that's how a platform could be added to it. So
Yeah.
it's a building onto your education platform.
One thing I've tried to do in that direction is to write a book called War is a Lie, by which I did not mean, as a few people thought, that war doesn't exist, but rather that everything we're told about war to justify it isn't true. And in fact, there were like some really smart people who told me that George W. Bush lying about Iraq was a new thing under the sun. It never happened before. And some other, almost as smart people telling me that, there had been war lies back in the 1960s and now again with George W. Bush. Well, I went and spent a long time reading about wars, U.S. wars, non-U.S. wars, wars back to antiquity, and I couldn't find a war that wasn't based on lies. And I found lies to start wars, lies to continue wars, lies to make wars seem better after the fact, and often 3 sets of completely different lies, but patterns, so I didn't, make a list of wars and explain the lies for each one, which would be a book this thick. I laid out the types of lies so that you can learn how to spot them. But I think the most important thing and the hardest for people is to understand that the stuff the Pentagon is telling you doesn't matter. It could be true, it could be false. It has nothing to do with justifying a war. Right? So here you have the United States chock full of weapons of mass destruction, claiming that the question is, does Iraq have weapons of mass destruction? If so, we get to have a war. If not, we don't. It's never the right question. The answer isn't actually ever relevant. Right? And so you don't have to say, well, I can't be sure because they know more than I do, and they're trained experts, killers and liars, and I'm just an ordinary person. No, you don't have to wait for a FOIA request decades later to find out if it was true or not. It's not even relevant. It doesn't have anything to do with, there isn't anything that can legally or morally or practically justify the greatest crime known to humanity. And so when there's a claim that some lesser crime has been committed, that somebody killed people with chemical weapons in Syria, and they should have been killing people with good civilized napalm and cluster bombs, and they used chemical weapons. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. It's important to find out what the truth of the matter is, but it has nothing to do with justifying a war. And so it's important to address each propaganda claim as it comes out, but also not to buy into its game.
Diana. Christianity became an imperial religion? Please fill in the blanks. Christianity became an imperial religion.
Well, I do not profess extreme expertise in Christianity, and I am an evangelical atheist, and I don't want to offend any Christians, but my basic understanding of history, that I don't think anyone disputes, is that Christianity grew as a religion counter to, very much counter to, the Roman Empire for centuries, and was persecuted by the Roman Empire, but eventually became the religion of that empire. And when it was a religion of empire, it was necessary to find academics who would explain to people why Jesus would have wanted them to engage in mass killing. And so how do you explain to people that a religion that professed peace and nonviolence and opposed militarism and in certain sects thereof has never ceased holding that view, actually, if you're smart enough, requires that you go out and line up and start killing people. Well, I mean, you do it the same way that you get U.S. college professors to explain that bombing the poor people in rural Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia is a humanitarian effort to move people into the cities where they'll be better educated. You do it with nonsense, right? Absolute patent nonsense. So you must respect, you must fully respect your enemy as you're killing him, right? And you must understand that you're doing him a favor by getting him to a better world, right? And so, you know, a lot of this stuff doesn't really hold up today unless you share certain beliefs that they held then. But, you know, I know a lot of ways for somebody to respect me, but killing me isn't really involved in any of them, you know? So you must, you know, the killings must be accidental, or what we would, you know, today call collateral damage. So you must not be actually intending them, even though you know that what you're doing is going to cause them. So what you do is you kill people, but you intend something else by it. I mean, it's all a bunch of mental gymnastics, and a lot of the categories, as I said, have nothing to do with morality whatsoever, right? The wars must be waged by proper authorities, right? I mean, who cares what the properness is of the authority that's killing you? The response to actions in wars must be proportionate. That sounds really cool, right? And international human rights lawyers talk about it nonstop to this day. The response must be proportionate. No one has ever defined what in the hell it means so that you can go out and measure it. When the U.S. military says you can blow up a building in Syria where the people we call terrorists are storing their money or their stuff, if it kills up to 49 people, but if it kills 50 people, it's not acceptable. Well, there's nowhere that I can go look on a calculation or a table and find out that, no, really, it was only supposed to be 8 people. Or actually, if it was 273 people, that would have been okay, but 274 was wrong. You just pull it out of the air. You just make it up. It's not empirical, right? And so, but it's still practiced in in U.S. and Western academia. The current Pope, by the way, who is just way more infallible than the last guy, in my opinion, had meetings a few years back at the Vatican on the topic of whether the Catholic Church should renounce just war theory and end the whole practice. And the interesting thing was that the people at the meetings who were not from the United States, Canada, Europe, had never heard of just war theory. You know, it's not practiced in the nations that the weapons are shipped to and the bombs are dropped on. It's practiced in the nations that engage in empire. It was developed to support empire, and that's what it does. And you know, in the end, the Pope is ready to say we must work on just peace and so forth, but not quite yet ready to formally, with what he calls an encyclical, end just war theory. But you know, they're that close to it, and we can move people in that direction.
Thank you.
Yep, you. I couldn't read very well.
Yeah, I've got one question and one something that I need you to expand on. The first one is, you mentioned that militarism was associated with climate change. So if you could expand on that. The second is, Mahatma Gandhi practiced non-violence. If that non-violence was used in the Second World War. Do you honestly think you would be able to pacify Hitler? There have been masses of people. There's 6 million people, Jews that were put in the Holocaust already with the war. So with non-violence, what would happen then?
On the first point, the U.S. military, I'll use a few U.S. stats because I know them and because it's the biggest military. The U.S. military alone, if it were put in a list of nations, would be 30-something or 40-something in the list of nations in terms of fossil fuel pollution. The U.S. military is the single biggest consumer of fossil fuel anywhere. And the third biggest polluter of U.S. waters, the first overwhelming top prize in the creation of major environmental disasters in the United States, what are called Superfund sites. The bases across the United States and the world that the United States has are permanently poisoning groundwater around almost all of these bases with these chemicals that they use to practice putting out fires, chemicals that never ever go away and that are deadly. So, and here we're talking about the nation and the bases that the military is supposed to be for, that it's protecting. If you look at the places that, Iraq will never ever recover. Birds will never go back to Afghanistan. I mean, these places have been destroyed, absolutely destroyed.
Depleted uranium.
Yeah, why are people still poor and suffering in Laos? Because half the place is still full of bombs that get more and more likely to explode. World War II bombs still exploding in Germany is a common occurrence. So war is absolutely devastating to the natural environment, on top of being the easiest place to go get the money for actual protection, actual security. I can talk for hours and hours about World War II. I'll try to talk for a few minutes, and you can tell me if I go too long. But I respectfully, I really don't like this practice that everybody engages in, not just you, of looking at death camps that killed 9 million people and saying that the problem is they killed 6 million Jews. I think the problem is that they killed 9 million people. I think every one of those people was a person. And just maybe sort of a minor point, even though it's a large number of people. But let me talk first about nonviolence in World War II, and then about the question of World War II more broadly. Nonviolence was practiced during World War II in numerous nations that were occupied by the Nazis and in Nazi Germany and in Berlin. And it was practiced by people who didn't have the foggiest clue what in the heck they were doing. There was no developed expertise and strategic reasoning of lessons and practices in nonviolence the way that there is now. I mean, this was the primitive days of nonviolence, and yet you had huge resistance. You had nations in Eastern Europe that saved most of the Jews and other targeted victims. You had great resistance in Scandinavia. You had the schools in Norway simply refused to teach Nazism and succeed. You had some resistance in the Netherlands when the Nazis told the King of Denmark to put the Nazi flag up on his castle, and he said no. They said, we're gonna send a soldier over there to do it. And he said, well, I'm going to send a Danish soldier right over there to take it back down. And he said, well, that Danish soldier is going to be shot. And the King of Denmark said, that Danish soldier is going to be me. And the Nazi flag did not go up, and the people of Copenhagen did not do anything they were told to do. And when the women in Berlin who were married to Jewish husbands had their husbands locked up, but not themselves because they weren't Jewish. And they went into a street called Rosenstrasse and began protesting. After a little while, random people started joining in with them. And that scared the hell out of the Nazis. And they freed those Jewish husbands. And those people, not having a clue what the hell they were doing, said, our work here is done, and went back home. That was the moment to escalate. That was the moment to take it to the next step. They didn't know. They didn't know how to do nonviolence. But for Gandhi to recommend that they figure out how was not some sort of insanity. It was a vision of better ways. And when you look at the past century, and you look at the studies by Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stefan and others that have found that principally nonviolent campaigns have been over twice as likely to succeed as the violent ones. And those successes infinitely longer lasting. Then you have to understand that nonviolence doesn't always work. Violence doesn't always work. But you don't resort to violence as a stronger tool. You resort to nonviolence as a stronger tool, more likely to work. And so this, but I just, I'm sorry to go on, but I just want to briefly touch on what I could spend hours on, which is the what about Hitler nonsense that has been used for every single war in the United States, at least for the past 75 years. And it's important to recognize that you couldn't have had World War II without World War I, which nobody defends in the slightest. And the stupid conclusion of which had smart people predicting World War II almost down to the date. If you're going to complain about World War II as the enemy and the foreign and the all-evil entity, you shouldn't have had Western governments supporting the rise of those regimes for years and Wall Street funding them right through the war with very little complaint from the Western governments. And Winston Churchill, literally within hours of the end of the war in Europe, proposing, along with some of the prominent US generals, a new war on Russia using German soldiers because Russia remained the real enemy to these people. And when the United States took the lead in some cases in organizing big conferences leading up to the war and through the war on whether to accept the Jews, because it's now somehow a secret that for years the Nazis' insanity was to expel the Jews if anyone would take them, not to kill them. That was a different insanity that came years later. Does anybody know what Evian means? No?
Papillon?
How do you spell it?
It's spelled naive backwards. E-V-I-A-N.
It's a conference.
Yes. You guys are not just smarter than the people in Surrey, but you have a couple people here who are smarter than anybody. Because nobody knows. In the United States, everybody says it's bottled water if you say, what is Evian? But it was the big news story of the week, a particular week. It was a very public conference with most governments of the world taking part, and they were all discussing, and Hitler was screaming, I'll send the Jews anywhere, I'll put them all on luxury cruise ships, who will take them, who will take them? And they decided, publicly, shamelessly, for anti-Semitic reasons, not to accept any of the Jews, but to condemn them to their fate. And Hitler was just, triumphant. Look at the hypocrites. They know I'm right. They know the Jews are evil. And then, and immediately you had the escalation of the violence and the shifting to killing them. And so, through the course of the war, you had peace groups, you had peace activists going to the US government and going to the British government and saying, will you take the Jews out of Germany? It wasn't that they weren't negotiating things with the Nazis, like, terms of prisoners of war and so forth. It wasn't that the Nazis wouldn't do it. It wasn't that the British couldn't do it after they'd evacuated all those troops from Dunkirk. It was repeatedly and explicitly that they couldn't be bothered, that they had a war to fight. And so you have this war, which, by the way, killed perhaps 60, 70 million people. It was the glorious cure for the disease that killed 9 million people. It was never, ever, ever secretly or publicly justified as having anything to do with the Nazi death camps until after it was over. After it was over. So you get this new set of lies about wars after they're over. And it wasn't the good war until the war on Vietnam, when it was unacceptable to oppose a war unless you support some other war. This is why people in the United States, around the time of Barack Obama's election, said they all supported the war on Afghanistan. Because you can't oppose the war on Iraq unless you support some other war, because you risk appearing to oppose the whole evil institution. Right? And so there was so much opposition to the war on Vietnam that you had to support World War II as the good war, in contrast to the bad war. Well, it wasn't. There's no such thing as a good war. And you can argue around more plausible justifications for it now, each of which I will respond to. But the most popular justifications for it are sheer fantasy and were concocted after the war.
Actually, both World War I and World War II were economic wars of economic interest and raping and pillaging. So most people have not read the history of either of those wars, and nobody bothers to go back to the think tanks, the secret think tanks. Nor has anybody here probably read the report on Iron Mountain, where they strategized on how to program the perpetual war, the perpetual system of destruction and rebuilding, so that we keep the economy going. And so an economic empire. I mean, there are many ways of fighting a war, but that really wasn't going to be my original comment. Since 1900, we have been fighting a war on health, and it is part of the other war. Because we have something called patents, which is a form of feudalism, which says, I own, and if you want it, you damn well pay me. And so consequently, all of medicine is patented, and basically allopathic medicine is a system of money. Vaccines is for money. GMO is for patents on the food supply, so that nobody else can have it, and it's a feudal system. So it's another form of war, but we do have a war on health. And quite frankly, more people die on that war of health and actually die on the other, as horrible as that is.
Yes, indeed. More Americans are killed by McDonald's than by Islamic terrorists.
Well, no, I'm not even talking about that. I'm talking about the planned, and of course, we're not even mentioning chemtrails and HAARP and manipulation of weather as a weapon of mass destruction, or the frequencies as the best, the artificial intelligence is the best of all stealth weapons, where we press a button and nobody even knows where it's coming from.
Roxanne?
Okay, my question actually is about
Microphone.
propaganda. Oh, okay. My question is about propaganda. Always has been used to justify wars. What worries me now is the sophistication and the overwhelming amount of propaganda. I have many wonderful friends who are good people, decent people with a moral compass, and they all believe that China is the enemy and Russia is the enemy because they're told that here in this country on a daily basis.
Mm-hmm.
How do we go around that mindset? How do we get people to start asking just a little question about what they're hearing and what they're seeing and what's being given to them all the time?
You know, in Surrey, a lot of people started out believing, or this afternoon, a lot of people started out believing that wars are sometimes justified and ended not so sure that's true. So you talk with people for some time about their questions and the common beliefs, and provide some facts. And this group and that group as well come into the room with more facts than most people. Most people who will tell you that Russia is the enemy, ask them, does the United States or Russia spend more on its military? Which one spends more? How many wars has each one started? How many foreign military bases does each one have? Which one has missiles in countries bordering the other, and which one does not? And provide them with some basic facts, because there is a problem of ideology and of resistance to learning facts you don't want to learn and so forth. But the bigger problem for most people is just the sheer absence of information. We talk about the flood of information and we're overwhelmed with information, but key important information is missing from most people's minds. I ask people if the United States were building these missile defense systems, these missile platforms on the border of Canada, aimed at Canadian cities, but claiming it was defensive or claiming it was just a jobs program for U.S. workers, would that be okay with Canadians?
Well, I do that, but I always get the same response. And that's what it is. If it's in the New York Times, if it's on the news,
Who owns
I don't know what that means, that's what it is.
Yeah, I know that, but these people, and there's many, many people.
What is the same response you always get? I didn't grasp what it is.
Oh, is that they don't question it. If it's said in the mainstream media, if it's in the
It's Russia, it's Russia,
on
it's
the
China,
news,
it's
Yes,
China.
but if
and
you tell them to
they're
question it.
bombarded with that morning, noon, and night, which they are.
Repetition. Goebbels talked about
May I
this.
say something? I am Cecilia's husband, and the friends that my wife referred to, they're also my friends. And many of them,
Microphone,
most-
can't hear you.
many of them, most of them, think emotionally first, they have an emotional response, and then rational thinking maybe will be induced by someone like my wife or someone like you, ask a question, etc. And when they are forced or induced into thinking rationally, then you start hearing, oh, it was just my opinion, I really don't know why I said it. They retreat.
Yes. I meant to question the initial assertion that wars have always used propaganda. I mean, it was really in World War I that the sort of propaganda we deal with now was developed. I mean, overwhelmingly, it was during World War I. And it's very powerful and it's very skillful, but a lot of it appeals to good emotions. It's not always an appeal to sadism. It's often an appeal to the best emotions, right? We must go slaughter each other in World War I because the Germans are killing poor Belgian children, right? And so you have to sit down with your friends who you say think emotionally, which is, by the way, not a bad thing, and ask them what those emotions are, what it is they're thinking, and make clear to them how much you agree. Try to get them to comprehend that you don't want Canada destroyed and our freedoms taken away by the evil North Koreans and so forth, and establish how much you actually agree. And then gently introduce some facts, like how many times each North Korean would have to clone him or herself in order to occupy something as large as Canada. What it would take for these nightmares to actually happen. The lack of threat from the enemies that they perceive out there. And going back to earlier comments, I think it's useful for people to know that more people are killed by toddlers who find a gun under the couch than by Middle Eastern terrorists, that more people are killed by unsafe workplaces, by staircases, that we're being afraid of the wrong things, and we gotta work on being afraid of nuclear apocalypse and climate apocalypse. We gotta be horrified and panicked, but about the right things.
Hi, before I make my comment, I just wanted to agree with this speaker, this lady here, that war has many manifestations, and certainly there is a war on the global health of the planet, every human being and every form of animal and plant that takes its place, takes form in the huge pharmaceutical industry. Chemtrails, if you don't know about it, educate yourself. 5G, HARP, all of these things. A lot of the things that we think are accidental or natural are in fact engineered. And speaking of engineering, I think one of the biggest things to get people's minds tweaked and start to think about war and conflict is for them to learn the term and see the examples through history, because we know with every engineered conflict, which is what they all are, there's always a boogeyman, there's always the false pretense, there's always the engineering and the staging, false flag operation. I would love to see that term put. Can you spot a false flag operation? Get that into high school students' minds, because as soon as they start thinking, oh wow, yeah, this is a frame, it's a setup, just like they see on their TV shows, but it's happening on a different scale. That is a term that I think everybody should know. If you don't know history and you don't understand how all these wars and so-called conflicts are engineered, we can just listen to Wesley Clark around, was it November 2001, where he said that, you know, basically he had heard from Rumsfeld, yeah, we're going to be going into, you know, we've got the plans, we're going into 7 countries, we're taking them out. It was all laid out ahead of time, and this notion that somehow these things just happen, no, it's all pre-planned, it's all engineered, and there's players up top pulling the strings. So I really would love to see that angle of educating and making people aware of that, so that cynicism, when they're confronted with the boogeyman and the false narrative, can be challenged more effectively, because they know how to spot or at least question if something's a false flag operation.
Exactly. We need skepticism. This is what I wrote War is a Lie for. And when we're told that Iran has seized some ship in the Strait of Hormuz, we need to be aware that there have been discussions of staging exactly that in Washington, D.C. We also, I argue, need to be aware of the fact that you don't get to bomb Iran even if Iran did seize some ship in the Strait of Hormuz. It's not actually relevant or a justification.
You don't like leaders, so you just kill the whole population, right?
Exactly. With the propaganda being all about the leader. Let me ask a harder one maybe then, Evian. Who can tell me where the term brainwashing comes from?
PR.
Brainwashing.
Edward Hayes.
CIA is correct. Random guess, but a good one always. When the United States was destroying North Korea, there were scientists in the CIA and who were, in touch with the CIA, who were trying to figure out how to completely manipulate people's brains. And they came up with one guy came up with this term brainwashing. And when the U.S. was, and this may sound absurd, and I hope at least some of you are aware of it before I say it, the U.S. was dropping feathers and insects on North Korea with bubonic plague and all kinds of diseases in them. And then U.S. pilots who were captured by the North Koreans and the Chinese were confessing to having done this. There needed to be some explanation in the U.S. media for why these U.S. pilots, who didn't seem to be insane, were making up all these insane stories that couldn't possibly be true. And so they pulled, their scientists who had actually been attempting this for the CIA to say, well, what the Chinese have done is they've brainwashed those pilots and they've installed these new beliefs in their brains, and they think they really dropped insects on North Korea. And this is where you got this Manchurian Candidate, story from. So let me now ask another one that may be easier, because I said that. Who knows where Lyme disease comes from?
Plum Island.
They stayed in Maryland, and they released it over New York.
Plum Island. The
Plum
research
Island.
center where they're using insects as vectors
That's right.
to pass
Almost,
disease, and that's down upwind from Lyme, Connecticut, unfortunately.
right, almost certainly Plum Island, off the tip of Long Island, New York, just across the water from Lyme, Connecticut, is the source of ticks that had been infected with this disease for use as a weapon, as in North Korea and Cuba and elsewhere. So again, thank you to the U.S. military.
And
I mean, we're
now
missing
they're
a
off-
bomb.
excuse me, and now they're offering real estate lots where you can build your houses on Plum Island.
Lovely, lovely.
Thank you for your time. My concern is the looming war on Iran. You touched upon it, and I'm just wondering, because in the lead up to the war on Iraq, there were demonstrations all over the world, and yet that war could not be stopped. Since Iran has been demonized basically since 1979, hostage crisis, I think perhaps it may be easier to sell that kind of war. And you from the United States, I thought, would be perhaps able to comment on the mood down there as to whether it is supportive in some way or a great way even. The other thing I just wanted to ask you is the Democratic nomination process is happening now, and I wondered if you had any idea about a possible candidate who would be supportive of the views you hold. Thank you so much.
I will try to be as concise as I can with those like 6 or 8 questions. The protests of the impending war on Iraq in 2002, 2003, in their defense, moved many nations against it, moved the United Nations against it, denied it UN authorization, made it a crime that under any reasonable future would have involved prosecution of the criminals, and educated enough people about it and made it, stigmatized it in such a way that it has helped discourage numerous wars since. Nobody has wanted to be, the idiot who does that again. And so there is such a thing as partial success, despite horrible failure. There has been much greater success thus far on preventing a war on Iran. Numerous times. In 2007, for example, we were told we urgently need a war on Iran or we're all going to die, and it was prevented. And it was prevented by outside agitation and by people within the U.S. so-called intelligence community, which is neither intelligent nor a community, putting out the information that Iran had no nuclear weapons program. And again in 2015, we had this huge debate in Washington, D.C. around whether, because we're lying to you that Iran has a nuclear weapons program, we should have a war on Iran, or the other side of the debate, which was, because we're lying to you that Iran has a nuclear weapons program, we should have an agreement or a treaty with Iran. Luckily, that side of the debate won, but the impact of the debate as a whole was negative because both sides were pushing the same false propaganda about Iran. By the way, that lead up to the war on Iraq, anybody remember who Catherine Gunn is?
Yes, she was,
Please.
she's the diplomat that permitted.
No, that was a different name. It was a different,
British. British.
She was and is British and absolutely heroic woman. Okay, how about this? Anybody know who Keira Knightley is?
Yes, the actress. And that new film is coming out.
Okay, so there is a wonderful, wonderful film coming out, major stars, big budget, Hollywood production, without the typical evil. I mean, this is an absolutely stunning case for moral, courageous action against war. And what had happened was that the NSA, the National Security Agency, which is none of the above, a guy at the NSA sent an email to the GCHQ, which is its equivalent over in England. These are people who spy on all your emails and phone calls and everything they can get their fingers on. And Catherine Gunn worked there at GCHQ, and they sent around this email to everybody there, and it said, who can dig up dirt on the ambassadors to the United Nations from the following list of countries, because we want to blackmail them and beat them up and get them to vote for the war on Iraq. This was in the lead up to Colin Powell's, show at the UN. And Catherine Gunn, I'll just tell you the start of the movie, and go see the movie, Official Secrets. She, made that memo public, and it was huge news story, and it very much helped promote the actions in the streets and helped prevent UN authorization of that war. And in those years, the CIA had given plans for really the key part of a nuclear bomb to Iran, and which you wouldn't think was what the CIA would do, but they had intentionally put a couple of very obvious mistakes in the plans. And the pretense was that this was somehow going to slow down Iran's non-existent nuclear weapons program by, sending them off track somehow. They sort of ignoring the fact that it was, obvious to any nuclear scientist. And a guy at the CIA was falsely accused of leaking this information, which would have been a public service, and put in jail. Which is what is done to whistleblowers nowadays, and they put him on trial in Virginia, where I live, and in the course of the trial, they revealed all this information, including a partially redacted message that made clear that right after they did that with Iran, they were going to do it with Iraq. So they're trying to provide nuclear weapons expertise to these countries in order to blame them for having it, right? And so what can be done, apart from exposing all of this history? There's a bill in Congress in the United States right now called the National Defense Authorization Act, which is not defensive and so on, and it has in it, among dozens of wonderful things we never dare dream of, forbidding any war on Iran. Now, the Kellogg-Briand Pact forbids any war on Iran, the UN Charter forbids any war on Iran, the US Constitution says you have to get Congress before you have any war on Iran, etc. But to pass a new law that explicitly forbids spending a dime on any war on Iran is a great thing. And this bill has in it no more participation in or weapons for the war on Yemen, ending the Korean War, ending the authorization for the use of military force, which is what they use to justify all these wars, imposing impossible requirements to justify any foreign military bases so we can start getting rid of them. Like dozens of things we never dare dream of are in the House version of this bill, but not the Senate version. So now they have to make a compromise from the two, which you would think would mean you get to keep half the good stuff, but remains to be seen. So if you can encourage anybody in the U.S. to go to rootsaction.org and click on the little thing to email and phone their Congress members and senators, we're trying to keep the good stuff in that bill. As far as whether people in the U.S. would support a war in Iran, it would take, as they say, a Pearl Harbor. Donald Trump claims to have come within 10 minutes of a war on Iran. It was very clear to him that nobody was going to like it, and they were going to think he was stupider than Bush. As far as the Democratic candidates, the best people are never in, and the best people who should be in are, censored. Does anyone know who Mike Gravel is?
Yes.
Who is he?
Well, I know he's a politician. Is it senator or something?
He's
I've heard him speak often.
He's a former senator from Alaska who read into the congressional record the Pentagon Papers, which he got from Daniel Ellsberg, which exposed all decades of lies about the war on Vietnam. He was excluded from the most recent debate because although he had many more donors to his campaign than required, he somehow didn't get enough support in polls in which his name had not been in the list of candidates. So among those who make it into the debates, then you have to pick who do you like the most, you know? And the United States is, you know, not just a meth lab, but a hospital for schizophrenics, and we like to put conflicting things together and not see the conflicts. And so, you know, the peace groups and people at events, and probably this one too, are most enthusiastic about a relatively young woman from Hawaii who is right now on a U.S. military mission in Indonesia because she's a member of the U.S. Army who sees running for president as a part-time thing and who can't oppose a war, and thank God she does. She opposes lots of them, far more than anybody else on those stages, without simultaneously bragging about having helped destroy Iraq. You know, so to my mind, that's a very mixed bag, right? It's like 3 cuts above your typical, like, Joe Biden, I killed my own son in Iraq, but I still think it was sort of a good idea, although Bush did it wrong. You know, she's above that, because she's got the good side. She's, you know, speaking out against all these wars. But she's speaking out against them as being the bad wars, like Obama. They aren't the good wars. Those are the ones we need. And she's not, you know, I mean, it's like Trump. You know, Trump said no more of these stupid wars and bad wars unless you steal the oil and kill more of their families. You know, but what you really have to look at is their position on military spending. I mean, it's the money you got to look at. And Tulsi Gabbard is very inconsistent on that. Trump was not. He and Obama, you know, and everybody before them wanted to increase military spending, and that's what's been done. I think if you want to move in a slightly better direction by means of an emperor on a throne who has powers nobody ever should, Bernie Sanders is probably your best bet. We published an open letter at worldbeyondwar.org with hundreds of prominent signers and got lots of groups to support it, asking Senator Sanders to have a better position on foreign policy than he did 4 years ago. And to a great extent he has, and his staff has met with us and talked about that, and they've, you know, tried to do better on foreign policy, and which is, you know, miles away from perfect, but also miles away from Donald Trump or, you know, Joe Biden or many others.
David has the next question.
Thank you, David, for coming up to Vancouver, and I hope you're enjoying the weather. I'm a Canadian citizen and also Iranian citizen, and I was born maybe 50 miles from the border of Iran and Iraq, so I saw a lot just growing up. And the problem is not the people who maybe die or lose a leg or lose a hand and disabled for the rest of their life. It's more of those places become literally not livable after the war. So even like 20, 30 years after, we were struggling with like environmental issues, jobs, just PTSDs, culture, migration, all that stuff. So as you can see, I end up in Canada. It's at peace. I enjoy the weather and the green leaves of trees, so that's good. One thing, growing up, so that war, which was initiated by Saddam Hussein, we always knew that it was a bad guy. So when the war started from U.S. to remove Saddam, in Iran, the idea was probably that's a good thing because Saddam was definitely a dictator. We wanted him to be removed, but the people of Iraq and no one in the region had the power to remove that dictator. He had just so much, it was like a rotten tree with big roots. But the way that U.S. it's also similar to Afghanistan, which I was also in Iran when that war started. The way that they start the wars and they carry the wars are not the way that they want to remove a dictator. When that war ended, we had a lot of Iraqis dead, refugees. Saddam was removed eventually, but that region went through a lot of problems. That was not something as people who were in war in Iraq wanted to see. They were coming to Iran for support and just as a refuge. Same with Afghanistan. So the idea of removing a dictator like Al-Qaeda or Saddam is not necessarily a bad thing, but the thing is the way that U.S. carries these wars is a true mess for environment. We still get, because it's a desert type area, so whatever you drop, it's a windy day, it all picks up, it travels through the region, kills the trees, kills the farms, animals. So it was always confusing for me to kind of grow up. We also don't like our current regime in Iran. And in our family gatherings, as a joke, we say, we don't know what to do. Any violent or non-violent thing we do in Iran to remove this regime is shut down immediately. You either go to prison or you're murdered or somehow. As a joke, we say maybe US will come and remove this government for us. It's honestly a joke that we lost it because European Union got an agreement that we say maybe Americans come and remove it. Then rings the bell that no, when they come, they just destroy everything. I went to a school in Iran that was actually made by Americans. Our forest around was the American eagle. I can show you the picture that they planted the trees in the form of the eagle. All our professors graduated from Stanford, Harvard. Good people. When I graduated, I went to an oil refinery that was built by Americans. So there are things that are really confusing. I think when it comes to dealing with Americans, you've got to be on their side 100%, slightly neutral, maybe okay, but if you're a little bit, you want to go your way, they just come and ruin it. So
Yeah.
just a thought. I don't necessarily have a question, but as someone who just experienced this.
That's okay. I appreciate the comments. And as you know, of course, the United States did get rid of an Iranian government in 1951 and put in arguably a much worse Iranian government that lasted until 1979. And the son of the guy who ran that government is sitting in a house in the Washington, D.C. area awaiting his turn. The United States likes to export these leaders for the benefit of other countries from the D.C. area. You know, they took a guy from George Washington University, which has graduated, you know, not just this guy Juan Guaido, who they sent to Venezuela, but the former dictator of South Korea and various others. You know, they should have it on like the ads for George Washington University. You get to pick a shithole country, as Trump calls them, and rule it. But you know, the thing about, you know, and there are Venezuelans right now who will tell you, we want a war. We want the United States to bomb our country because we don't like our government. The really hard thing to do is to find anybody, whether they wanted that or not, who's glad that they got it. Right? I mean, you can't find people in Iraq or Afghanistan or Libya or anywhere who's glad that the U.S. came and got rid of their horrible government. Of course, they had a horrible government, but you don't get a better one by bringing in bombs and tanks and soldiers. At least you haven't yet. You know, it hasn't worked yet. And so I don't... you know, I think we have to appreciate that people need better governments, but not make them worse with false solutions. You know, it just doesn't work. There was a poll in, I think, 65 countries, a Gallup polling a few years back that asked people, what country on earth is the biggest threat to peace in the world? And what country do you think got top prize in the most countries around the world? You would be surprised to know that, not that you are correct because you're smart, but that when I ask that question in the US, they don't know that answer. But What do you think was the answer in the US?
China.
Somebody said it. It's not a fair question because it changes every few months depending on who's the new Hitler in the news that week. But it was Iran. It was Iran. And Iran, which spends less than 1% what the US does on its military, it has literally not started a war in centuries. Iran is the biggest threat to peace in the world. Yeah, now it would be Russia. It changes with the news. But this is propaganda. This is what we're up against.
Do we need regime change?
Regime change begins at home, right?
Yeah, do we need regime change? Who's going to change that for us? And how about the School of Americas?
I would not give them the job. I think we would get a disaster out of it. They tried to give Smedley Butler the job, and he told them to go to hell. I don't think we need a fascist regime change.
No, I'm being facetious, but I mean, I don't think many people know what the School of Americas is.
Raise your hand if you know what the School of Americas is or was. Yeah, these people know, but you're right, most people don't.
I mean, we basically trained these damn people who went to other countries and became their dictators.
Well, I don't, and I don't think we should use the first person plural to talk about the criminals we're opposing, but it's not basically, it's clear cut. The U.S. military has trained many torturers and assassins and coup leaders.
Joseph, you're next.
Thank you. Thank you, David, for your deep work for world peace and the abolition of war, which we are going to support you on. Ralph Nader, an amazing book I read recently, is How to Break Through Power. It's easier than you think. And he talks about 1% of the people getting organized and organizing the 535 communities in the United States. We do the same thing in Canada. He's done amazing work. Another book by George Lakey, How to Win Using Nonviolent Direct Action, which would be useful for anyone that's wondering if nonviolent direct action works or not. But there has to be more than just a demonstration or a protest. You have to have a campaign that can keep the pressure on, that can outlast the people that are doing the bad things. And you not only have to have a campaign, you have to join with other campaigns and build a coalition so you have a movement, a morally based movement of values for peace. And that's what George Lakey talks about. That's Lake with a Y on the end of it in his book. So I got a little list here while I was sitting here. What you're talking about now reminds me of what started back in the 1970s with the work in BC to stop open pit uranium mining. How many people in this room know that we stopped uranium mining coming to BC? Well, guess what? It took us a long time, but we kept Denison Mines, the largest uranium mining company in Canada, from having an open pit uranium mine in Clearwater, BC. And it was people like us that did it. And they had all the money in the world, and all three levels of government were for it, for jobs, etc., etc. But people like us, working together with a common cause, achieved that. Also, how many people in this room know that BC Hydro was offered a free atomic reactor by AECL? Yeah, we were offered our first atomic reactor for free. Canadian Coalition for Nuclear Responsibility opposed that, and we refused. We had to educate for years and years, but we managed to stop BC from getting an atomic reactor for generating electricity when we absolutely don't need it. But that's also. Then, how many people in this room here came here because they saw something about this on television? Nobody. No. How many people came here because they saw this in the Vancouver Sun or the Globe and Mail or the New York Times or the Washington Post? No. Nobody. Okay. How many people saw it in the Georgia Strait? One person.
Common ground.
How many people saw it in Common Ground? That's what I work for, Common Ground.
You are
Nice
Common
job.
Ground.
Well,
You
so
did good.
So you have to build a coalition, and I really honor what you're doing. This feels like the fresh new energy that existed back in 1980, 81, 82, when we organized the first Walk for Peace in Vancouver, which had 35,000 people come out to it. We need to grab this energy and work with it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for producing good media, and thank you for promoting this event, and thank you for your comments. Who knows where Iran got its nuclear energy facilities back in the 1970s? The guy from Iran, yes. Where?
Americans.
From the United States, yes. That you can go back and look in U.S. magazines and newspapers from the 1970s and find big full-page color ads with full-body portrait of the Shah of Iran that say, "Look who loves nuclear energy," because it was an endorsement of nuclear energy by the good dictator of Iran. By the way, we've prevented the same thing with uranium in Virginia, where I live, though I didn't have anything to do with it. But one thing that's happening right now that is working is these divestment campaigns. And we didn't need 3.5% of people in my little city in Virginia to get the city council to divest from weapons and fossil fuels. We did both because we thought it would be easier than just weapons. At the extreme, we had 0.5% of people doing anything whatsoever. And there was no opposition. There was not a single glimmer of a hint of a single individual, much less organized, funded organizations, against divesting public dollars from weapons. And we made a case that had nothing to do with patriotism, right? We said these weapons companies deal weapons to dictatorships all around the globe. They're used on both sides of many wars. This is an evil business. And they're here too. These guns and this violence comes back to where we live, which you may have seen happen in Charlottesville on the news a couple of years ago. And there was no opposition. We moved this forward rapidly, and we said stop using public dollars against us. We shouldn't have people do a nice job teaching school for decades and retire, and then have their retirement dependent on how many people get killed in North Africa that year. It shouldn't, it's immoral. This is a campaign that can succeed, and success brings in more people, and it's educational and effective at the same time. So, it's one thing that I think is well worth trying. There are many.
Yes, thank you for coming, David Swanson. I heard about you from my friend Adrian over here. We were at the Powell Street Festival, and I like a lot of community events and stuff, and I wasn't really sure if you were a U.S. citizen or what you were. I'm a dual citizen in Canada and the U.S. I actually didn't refuse to go to fight in Vietnam, but I told them they couldn't have my blood, so they couldn't take me into the army. And my dad was the opposite of me. He was a major in the army, and he also worked in counterintelligence, and I didn't know any of the stuff was going on. And what your job is to me so fascinating, because you are learning, trying to educate people around the globe, and I really appreciate you coming here, because there's so much misinformation and so hard to get the truth about the U.S. I know the CIA is here, I know the FBI is in Canada, I know all this stuff, but I want to ask you one question. Is there ever been a war that wasn't about money? It's always been about the dollar or whatever we could control. And the U.S. is just terrible. I'm just thinking, I gotta stop going down there. But I have all my family down there. except for, you know, a few outside of the U.S. What do you say to Canadians that want to make a change about Canada? Because Canada is following right behind the U.S. And it's scary. I mean, I'm really helpful to hear that this young man over here that works for Common Ground is alerting people to what the dangers that are going on. But there's so many dangers. And I just thank you for coming. I didn't really have a question to ask you, except that one question about money. But it goes on and on and on. Thank you.
Well, you know, there are those who will tell you that every war is just about money, and there are others who will tell you that every war is just about empire and expanding territory. And there are those who will tell you that every war is just about politics and elections. And when I look at particular wars, I can't find any that aren't about more than one thing. They all seem to be about numerous things. I don't know of any that, I mean, obviously war predates money as we know it, but I don't think there's any war that's demonstrably has nothing to do with greed and gain. I think that's an intimate part of most wars. But when you look at the inside discussions that come out decades later of how war planners talked, away from the public, first of all, you notice that they never say a damn word about the troops, where every public comment, the war must be continued for the benefit of the poor suckers who are in it. They're just called supporting the troops. It's never mentioned, ever. And there's no mention of humanitarian goals, But when you look at the real reasons, they include politics, they include money, they include all sorts of, corrupt and shameful things. But they often don't seem to quite answer the question for me. And, when they would have discussions about why to continue the war on Vietnam, they would have a conversation about why to tell each other to continue it. And then they would have a conversation about why to tell the public to continue it. But they would just start out with, we're going to continue it, and it was for the purpose of not ending it, And I don't think you can explain insane activities purely with sane rationale. I think you have to add in insanity and mad power lust and sadism. People ask, how could poor little Harry Truman 74 years ago this week drop bombs on those Japanese cities? How could he justify it in his mind? You guys don't understand. To his mind, killing more Japanese people was an advantage of dropping those bombs. It wasn't a downside to be outweighed by some good side. Right? This is the guy, Harry Truman, who stood up in the Senate before he was president and said, if the Russians are winning, let's help the Germans. If the Germans are winning, let's help the Russians. That way more people die. This was the value he placed on European lives. Right? So I think there are insane reasons involved. And I think, the message to Canada is don't go insane. Don't follow a lunatic into an asylum. If you want to generate anti-Canadian terrorist networks on the scale that the U.S. has generated for itself, follow the U.S. footsteps, And I am not a U.S. citizen. I'm a world citizen. And if you go to worldbeyondwar.org on the page for donating, we have the option, instead of donating, go to this group that we recommend that sells world passports and get yourself a world passport.
Okay. And the Rockefellers, they have the population agenda through the wars.
There's a lot of people that are on the list to ask questions. Let's let them have a turn first.
I'm curious about, obviously war isn't possible without its main labor force of foot soldiers or people with very little power within the army, but, you know, acting as like the main source of labor there. And besides like draft dodgers in the Vietnam War, in your research, have you encountered a lot of soldiers like deserting, going on strike, sort of working against the war by withholding that labor?
Yes, absolutely. Desertion, as well as conscientious objection and resistance and refusal to redeploy is far more common than advertised. There's a friend of mine who's on the board of World Beyond War named Robert Fantina, who deserted the United States some years back and moved to Canada, who has published a book a few years back about desertion through the history of U.S. wars. And it has been very, very common and very, very admirable. And I have great gratitude to the history of Canada for accepting so many people who were fleeing wars and slavery and high drug prices and you know, every other disadvantage of being south of the border. You know, I'm on the advisory board of a group called Veterans for Peace. I am not a veteran, but many of the best peace activists in the U.S. and around the world are in Veterans for Peace and groups like it. And there is, you know, Veterans for Peace in a number of countries now, including Russia. And, you know, it's good that they're veterans both because they actually know war from that perspective and because of the disastrous, misplaced respect for veterans in our culture, which they actually oppose themselves. So, but I think what we need to do is get to people before they become veterans.
Okay, thanks, David. We need to wrap up. I know there were a few other people that had questions, but we need to wrap it up. You can ask those questions informally after.
No, actually, I don't have a question, but you know, in the Korean War, the army found that only 20% of the soldiers were able to kill other people. And that's when they came back and had Hollywood start with the violent video games. Quite frankly, actions are attitudes in motion. Now, if we want to change the attitude, then we really have to basically have a campaign that makes parents aware of the fact that when they allow their children to play violent video games where killing the opposition is the only way to get what you want, then we'll never break the forming of this attitude. We have to start at the family level and say, out with violent video games, out with this brainwashing at the earliest age.
Okay,
Which
thank you for that.
desensitizes everybody.
Thank you for that. So we're going to wrap it up now, as I said. I want to thank everybody for coming out here today. I want to thank David for his wisdom and time that he spent with us. And thanks to all the volunteers that helped out, to all the committee members that helped out in organizing this event. And please join the chapter. We're a new chapter. We need more people. We need more energy. We have lots and lots of work to do. Lots of different campaigns we can get involved in. So let us know if you want to become involved in this new chapter. And there's an election coming up. So let's take part in these all committee, all candidate meetings that will come up and bring up questions on foreign policy. That actually will be one of our next projects after this, we recover from these events. We're going to be working with a few other groups and develop a plan so that we have at least one person from one of our collective groups attend these all candidate meetings and bring up these questions on foreign policy. So let's join this chapter and thank you, everybody.
Yeah. I think there would be an appreciation here if there was a way people could all